Chapter 26 of the Adventures of Ferdinand Count Fathom by Tobias Smollett. Recording is in the public domain. I should be ungrateful as well as unwise, did I longer resist the desire you expressed to know the particulars of that destiny which hath driven me to this miserable disguise, and rendered me in all considerations the most wretched of men. I have felt your friendship, I am confident of your honour, and though my misfortunes are such as can never be repaired, because I am utterly cut off from hope, which is the wretch's last comfort, yet I may, by your means, be enabled to bear them with some degree of fortitude and resignation. Know then, my name is not Ali, neither am I of Persian extraction. I had once the honour to own myself a Castilian, and was, under the appellation of Don Diego de Zelos, respected as the head of one of the most ancient families of that kingdom. Judge then how severe that distress must be, which compels a Spaniard to renounce his country, his honours, and his name. My youth was not spent in inglorious ease, neither did it waste unheeded in the rolls of fame. Before I had attained the age of 19, I was twice wounded in battle. I once fortunately recovered the standard of the regiment to which I belonged, after it had been seized by the enemy, and at another occasion made shift to save the life of my colonel, when he lay at the mercy of an enraged barbarian. He that thinks I recapitulate these particulars out of ostentation, does wrong to the unhappy Don Diego de Zelos, who, in having performed these little acts of gallantry, thinks he has done nothing, but simply approved himself worthy of being called a Castilian. I mean only to do justice to my own character, and to make you acquainted with one of the most remarkable incidents of my life. It was my fate, during my third campaign, to command a troop of horse in the regiment of Don Gonzales Arguello, between whom and my father a family feud had long been maintained with great enmity; and that gentleman did not leave me without reason to believe he rejoiced at the opportunity of exercising his resentment upon his adversary's son; for he withheld from me that countenance which my fellow officers enjoyed, and found means to subject me to divers mortifications, of which I was not at liberty to complain. These I bore in silence for some time, as part of my probation in the character of a soldier, resolved, nevertheless, to employ my interest at court for a removal into another corps, and to take some future opportunity of explaining my sentiments to Don Gonzales upon the injustice of his behaviour. While I animated myself with these sentiments against the discouragements I underwent, and the hard duty to which I was daily exposed, it was our fate to be concerned in the battle of Saragossa, where our regiment was so severely handled by the English infantry, that it was forced to give ground with the loss of 1/2 of its officers and men. Don Gonzales, who acted as brigadier in another wing, being informed of our fate, and dreading the disgrace of his corps, which had never turned back to the enemy, put spurs to his horse, and riding across the field at full speed, rallied our broken squadrons, and led us back to the charge with such intrepidity of behaviour as did not fail to inspire us all with uncommon courage and alacrity. For my own part, I thought myself doubly interested to distinguish my valour, not only on account of my own glory, but likewise on the supposition that, as I was acting under the eye of Gonzales, my conduct would be narrowly observed. I therefore exerted myself with unusual vigour, and as he began the attack with the remains of my troop, fought close by his side during the rest of the engagement. I even acquired his applause in the very heat of battle. When his hat was struck off, and his horse fell under him, I accommodated and remounted him upon my own, and, having seized for my own use another that belonged to a common trooper, attended this stern commander as before, and seconded him in all his repeated efforts. But it was impossible to withstand the numbers and impetuosity of the foe, and Don Gonzales, having the mortification to see his regiment cut in pieces, and the greatest part of the army routed, was fain to yield to the fortune of the day. Yet he retired as became a man of honour and a Castilian. That is, he marched off with the great deliberation in the rear of the Spanish troops, and frequently faced about to check the pursuit of the enemy. Indeed, this exercise of his courage had well nigh cost him his life, for, in one of those wheelings, he was left almost alone, and a small party of the Portuguese horse had actually cut off our communication with the retreating forces of Spain. In this dilemma, we had no other chance of saving our lives and liberty, than that of opening a passage sword in hand, and this was what Gonzales instantly resolved to attempt. We accordingly recommended our souls to God, and charging the line abreast of one another, bore down all opposition, and were in a fair way of accomplishing our retreat, without further danger. But the gallant Orguilo, in crossing a ditch, had the misfortune to be thrown from his horse, and was almost the same instant overtaken by one of the Portuguese dragoons, whose sword was already suspended over his head, as he lay half stunned with his fall. When I rode up, discharged a pistol in the ruffian's brain, and seating my colonel on his horse, had the good fortune to conduct him to a place of safety. Here he was provided with such accommodation as his case required, for he had been wounded in the battle, and dangerously bruised by his fall, and when all the necessary steps were taken towards his recovery, I desired to know if he had any further commands for his service, being resolved to join the army without delay. I thought proper to communicate this question by message, because he had not spoke one word to me during our retreat, notwithstanding the good office he had received at my hands, a reserve which I attributed to his pride, and resented accordingly. He no sooner understood my intention than he desired to see me in his apartment, and, as near as I can remember, spoke to this effect: "Were your father Don Alonso alive, I should now, in consequence of your behaviour, banish every suggestion of resentment, and solicit his friendship with great sincerity. Yes, Don Diego, your virtue hath triumphed over that enmity I bore your house, and I upbraid myself with the ungenerous treatment you have suffered under my command. But it is not enough for me to withdraw that rigour which it was unjust to exercise, and would be wicked to maintain. I must likewise atone for the injuries you have sustained, and make some suitable acknowledgment for that life which I have twice today owed to your valour and generosity. Whatever interest I have at court shall be employed in your behalf, and I have other designs in your favour, which shall be disclosed in due season. Meanwhile, I desire you will still add one obligation to the debt which I have already incurred, and carry this billet in person to my Estefania, who, from the news of this fatal overthrow, must be in despair upon my account." So saying, he presented a letter directed to his lady, which I received in a transport of joy, with expressions suitable to the occasion, and immediately set out for his country house, which happened to be about 30 leagues from the spot. This expedition was equally glorious and interesting, for my thoughts upon the road were engrossed by the hope of seeing Don Orgulo's daughter and heiress Antonia, who was reported to be a young lady of great beauty, and the most amiable accomplishments. However ridiculous it may seem for a man to conceive a passion for an object which he hath never beheld, certain it is, my sentiments were so much prepossessed by the fame of her qualifications, that I must have fallen victim to her charms, had they been much less powerful than they were. Notwithstanding the fatigues I had undergone in the field, I closed not an eye until I arrived at the gate of Gonzales, being determined to precede the report of the battle, that Madame d'Orgulo must not be alarmed for the life of her husband. I declared my errand, and was introduced into a saloon, where I had not waited above 3 minutes, when my colonel's lady appeared, and in great confusion received the letter, exclaiming, "Heaven grant that Don Gonzales be well!" In reading the contents, She underwent a variety of agitations, but, when she had perused the whole, her countenance regained its serenity, and regarding me with an air of ineffable complacency, "Don Diego," said she, "while I lament the national calamity in the defeat of our army, I, at the same time, feel the most sincere pleasure on seeing you upon this occasion, and, according to the directions of my dear lord, bid you heartily welcome to this house, as his preserver and friend. I was not unacquainted with your character before this last triumph of your virtue, and have often prayed to Heaven for some lucky determination of that fatal quarrel which raged so long between the family of Gonzales and your father's house. My prayers have been heard, the long wished for reconciliation is now effected, and I hope nothing will ever intervene to disturb this happy union." To this polite and affectionate declaration I made such reply as became a young man, whose heart overflowed with joy and benevolence, and desired to know how soon her answer to my commander would be ready, that I might gratify his impatience with all possible despatch. After having thanked me for this fresh proof of my attachment, she begged I would retire into a chamber, and repose myself from the uncommon fatigues I must have undergone. But, finding I persisted in the resolution of returning to Don Gonzales, without allowing myself the least benefit of sleep, she left me engaged in conversation with an uncle of Don Gonzales, who lodged in the house, and gave orders that a collation should be prepared in another apartment, while she retired to her closet, and wrote a letter to her husband. In less than an hour from my first arrival, I was introduced into a most elegant dining room, where a magnificent entertainment was served up, and where we were joined by Donna Estefania, and her beautiful daughter, the fair Antonia, who, advancing with the most amiable sweetness, thanked me in very warm expressions of acknowledgment for the generosity of my conduct towards her father. I had been ravished with her first appearance, which far exceeded my imagination, and my faculties were so disordered by this address, that I answered her compliment with the most awkward confusion. But this disorder did not turn to my prejudice in the opinion of that lovely creature, who has often told me in the sequel that she gave herself credit for that perplexity in my behaviour, and that I never appeared more worthy of her regard and affection than at that juncture, when my dress was discomposed, and my whole person disfigured by the toils and duty of the preceding day. For this very dishabille presented itself to her reflection as the immediate effect of that very merit by which I was entitled to her esteem. Wretch that I am, to survive the loss of such an excellent woman, endeared to my remembrance by the most tender offices of wedlock, happily exercised for the space of 25 years! Forgive these tears, they are not the drops of weakness, but remorse. Not to trouble you with idle particulars, suffice it is to say, I was favoured with such marks of distinction by Madame d'Orgulo, that she thought it incumbent upon her to let me know that she had not overreacted her hospitality, and while we sat at table, accosted me in these words: "You will not be surprised, Don Diego, at my expressions of regard, which I own are unusual from a Spanish lady to a young cavalier like you, when I communicate the contents of this letter from Don Gonzales." So saying, she put the billet into my hand, and I read these words, or words to this effect: "Amiable Estefania, you will understand that I am as well as a person can possibly be who hath this day lived to see the army of his king defeated. If you would know the particulars of this unfortunate action, your curiosity will be gratified by the bearer, Don Diego de Zelos, to whose virtue and bravery I am twice indebted for my life. I therefore desire you will receive him with that respect and gratitude which you shall think due for such an obligation, and in entertaining him, dismiss that reserve which often disgraces the Spanish hospitality. In a word, let your own virtue and beneficence conduct you upon this occasion, and let my Antonia's behaviours be joined with your own in doing honour to the preserver of her father. Adieu." Such a testimonial could not fail of being very agreeable to a young soldier, who by this time had begun to indulge the transporting hope of being happy in the arms of the adorable Antonia. I professed myself extremely happy in having met with an opportunity of acquiring such a degree of my colonel's esteem, entertained them with a detail of his personal prowess in the battle, and answered all their questions with that moderation which every man ought to preserve in speaking of his own behaviour. Our repast being ended, I took my leave of the ladies, and at parting received a letter from Donna Estifania to her husband, together with a ring of great value, which she begged I would accept, as a token of her esteem. Thus loaded with honour and caresses, I set out on my return for the quarters of Don Gonzales, who could scarce credit his own eyes when I delivered his lady's billet, for he thought it impossible to perform such a journey in so short a time. When he had glanced over the paper, "Don Diego," said he, "by your short stay, one would imagine you had met with indifferent reception at my house. I hope Estifania has not been deficient in her duty." I answered this question by assuring him my entertainment had been so agreeable in all respects, that nothing but my duty to him could have induced me to give it up so soon. He then turned the conversation upon Antonia, and hinted his intention of giving her in marriage to a young cavalier, for whom he had a particular friendship. I was so much affected by this insinuation, which seemed at once to blast all my hopes of love and happiness, that the blood forsook my face. I was seized with a universal trepidation, and even obliged to retire, on pretence of being suddenly taken ill. Though Gonzales seemed to impute this disorder to fatigue and want of rest, he in his heart ascribed it to the true cause; and, after having sounded my sentiments to his own satisfaction, blessed me with a declaration importing that I was the person upon whom he had pitched for a son-in-law. I will not trouble you with a repetition of what passed on this interesting occasion, but proceed to observe that his intention in my favour was far from being disagreeable to his lady, and that, in a little time, I had the good fortune to espouse the charming Antonia, who submitted to the will of her father without reluctance. Soon after this happy event, I was by the influence of Don Gonzales, joined to my own interest, promoted to the command of a regiment, and served with honour during the remaining part of the war. After the treaty of Utrecht, I was employed in reducing the Catalans to their allegiance, and, in an action with those obstinate rebels, had the misfortune to lose my father-in-law, who by that time was preferred to the rank of a major general. The virtuous Estifania did not long survive this melancholy accident, and the loss of these indulgent parents made such a deep impression upon the tender heart of my Antonia, that I took the first opportunity of removing her from a place in which every object served to cherish her grief, to a pleasant villa near the city of Seville, which I purchased on account of its agreeable situation. That I might the more perfectly enjoy the possession of my amiable partner, who could no longer brook the thoughts of another separation, peace was no sooner re-established, than I obtained leave to resign my commission, and wholly devoted myself to the joys of a domestic life. Heaven seemed to smile upon our union by blessing us with a son, whom, however, it was pleased to recall in his infancy to our unspeakable grief and mortification. But our mutual chagrin was afterwards alleviated by the birth of a daughter, who seemed born with every accomplishment to excite the love and admiration of mankind. Why did nature debase such a masterpiece with the mixture of an alloy which hath involved herself and her whole family in perdition? But the ways of Providence are unsearchable. She hath paid the debt of her degeneracy. Peace be with her soul. The honour of my family is vindicated, though by a sacrifice which hath robbed me of everything else that is valuable in life, and ruined my peace past all redemption. Yes, my friend, all the tortures that human tyranny can inflict would be ease, tranquillity, and delight to the unspeakable pangs and horrors I have felt. But to return from this digression, Serafina, which was the name of that little darling, as she grew up, not only disclosed all the natural graces of external beauty, but likewise manifested the most engaging sweetness of disposition, and a capacity for acquiring with ease all the accomplishments of her sex. It is impossible to convey any adequate idea of a parent's raptures in the contemplation of such a fair blossom. She was the only pledge of our love. She was presumptive heiress to a large fortune, and likely to be the sole representative of two noble Castilian families. She was the delight of all who saw her, and a theme of praise for every tongue. You are not to suppose that the education of such a child was neglected. Indeed, it wholly engrossed the attention of me and my Antonia, and her proficiency rewarded our care. Before she had attained the age of 15, she was mistress of every elegant qualification, natural and acquired. Her person was, by that time, the confessed pattern of beauty. Her voice was enchantingly sweet, and she touched the lute with the most ravishing dexterity. Heaven and earth, how did my breast dilate with joy at the thoughts of having given birth to such perfection! How did my heart gush with paternal fondness whenever I beheld this ornament of my name! And what scenes of endearing transport have I enjoyed with my Antonia, in mutual congratulation upon our parental happiness! Serafina, accomplished as she was, could not fail to make conquests among the Spanish cavaliers, who are famous for sensibility in love. Indeed, she never appeared without a numerous train of admirers; and though we had bred her up in that freedom of conversation and intercourse which holds a middle space between the French licence and Spanish restraint, she was now so much exposed to the addresses of promiscuous gallantry, that we found it necessary to retrench the liberty of our house, and behave to our male visitants with great reserve and circumspection, that our honour and peace might run no risk from the youth and inexperience of our daughter. This caution produced overtures from a great many young gentlemen of rank and distinction, who courted my alliance, by demanding Serafina in marriage; and from the number I had actually selected one person, who was in all respects worthy the possession of such an inestimable prize. His name was Don Manuel de Mendoza. His birth was noble, and his character dignified, with repeated acts of generosity and virtue. Yet, before I would signify to him my approbation of his suit, I resolved to inform myself whether or not the heart of Serafina was totally unengaged, and indifferent to any other object, that I might not lay a tyrannical restraint upon her inclinations. The result of my inquiry was a full conviction of her having hitherto been deaf to the voice of love; and this piece of information, together with my own sentiments in his favour, I communicated to Don Manuel, who heard these tidings with transports of gratitude and joy. He was immediately favoured with opportunities of acquiring the affection of my daughter, and his endeavours were at first received with such respectful civility as might have been easily warmed into a mutual passion, had not the evil genius of our family interposed. Oh, my friend, how shall I describe the depravity of that unhappy virgin's sentiments? How recount the particulars of my own dishonour? I that am descended from a long line of illustrious Castilians, who never received an injury they did not revenge, but washed away every blemish in their fame with the blood of those who attempted to stain it. In that circumstance I have imitated the example of my glorious progenitors, and that consideration alone hath supported me against all the assaults of despair. As I grudged no pains and expense in perfecting the education of Serafina, my doors were open to every person who made an extraordinary figure in the profession of those amusing sciences in which she delighted. The house of Don Diego de Zelos was a little academy for painting, poetry, and music, and heaven decreed that it should fall a sacrifice to its regard for these fatal and delusive arts. Among other preceptors, it was her fate to be under the instruction of a cursed German, who, though his profession was drawing, understood the elements and theory of music, possessed a large fund of learning and taste, and was a person remarkable for his agreeable conversation. This traitor, who, like you, had lost one eye, I not only admitted into my house for the improvement of my daughter, but even distinguished with particular marks of confidence and favour, little thinking he had either inclination or capacity to debauch the sentiments of my child. I was rejoiced beyond measure to see with what alacrity she received his lessons, with what avidity she listened to his discourse, which was always equally moral, instructing, and entertaining. Antonia seemed to vie with me in expressions of regard for this accomplished stranger, whom she could not help supposing to be a person of rank and family, reduced to his present situation by some unfortunate vicissitude of fate. I was disposed to concur with this opinion, and actually conjured him to make me his confidant, with such protestations as left him no room to doubt my honour and beneficence. But he still persisted in declaring himself the son of an obscure mechanic in Bohemia, an origin to which surely no man would pretend who had the least claim to nobility and birth. While I was thus undeceived in my conjecture touching his birth and quality, I was confirmed in an opinion of his integrity and moderation, and looked upon him as a man of honour, in despite of the lowness of his pedigree. Nevertheless, he was at bottom a most perfidious wretch, and all this modesty and self-denial were the effects of the most villainous dissimulation, a cloak under which he, unsuspected, robbed me of my honour and my peace. Not to trouble you with particulars, the recital of which would tear my heartstrings with indignation and remorse, I shall only observe that, by the power of his infernal insinuation, he fascinated the heart of Serafina, brought over Antonia herself to the interests of his passion, and at once detached them both from their duty and religion. Heaven and earth! How dangerous, how irresistible is the power of infatuation! While I remained in the midst of this blind security, waiting for the nuptials of my daughter, and indulging myself with the vain prospect of her approaching felicity, Antonia found means to protract the negotiations of the marriage, by representing that it would be a pity to deprive Serafina of the opportunity she then had of profiting by the German's instructions; and upon that account I prevailed upon Don Manuel to bridle the impatience of his love. During this interval, as I one evening enjoyed the cool air in my own garden, I was accosted by an old duenna, who had been my nurse, and lived in the family since the time of my childhood. "My duty," said she, "will no longer permit me to wink in silence at the wrongs I see you daily suffer. Dismiss that German from your house without delay, if you respect the glory of your name, and the rites of our holy religion. The stranger is an abominable heretic, and, grant Heaven, he may not have already poisoned the minds of those you hold most dear." I had been extremely alarmed at the beginning of this address, but finding the imputation limited to the article of religion, in which, thank God, I am no bigot, I recovered my serenity of disposition, thanked the old woman for her zeal, commended her piety, and encouraged her to persevere in making observations on such subjects as should concern my honour and my quiet. We live in such a world of wickedness and fraud, that a man cannot be too vigilant in his own defence. Had I employed such spies from the beginning, I should in all probability have been at this day in possession of every comfort that renders life agreeable. The duenna, thus authorised, employed her sagacity with such success, that I had reason to suspect the German of a design upon the heart of Serafina; but, as the presumptions did not amount to conviction, I contented myself with exiling him from the house, under the pretext of having discovered that he was an enemy to the Catholic Church, and forthwith appointed a day for the celebration of my daughter's marriage with Don Manuel de Mendoza. I could easily perceive a cloud of melancholy overspread the faces of Serafina and her mother, when I declared these my resolutions; but, as they made no objection to what I proposed, I did not at that time enter into an explanation of the true motives that influenced my conduct. Both parties were probably afraid of such expostulation. Meanwhile, preparations were made for the espousals of Serafina, and, notwithstanding the anxiety I had undergone on account of her connection with the German, I began to think that her duty, her glory, had triumphed over all such low-born considerations, if ever they had been entertained, because she, and even Antonia, seemed to expect the ceremony with resignation, though the features of both still retained evident marks of concern, which I willingly imputed to the mutual prospect of their separation. This, however, was but a faithless calm, that soon, too soon, brought forth a tempest which hath wrecked my hopes. 2 days before the appointed union of Don Manuel and Serafina, I was informed by the duenna, that, while she accompanied Antonia's waiting maid at church, she had seen her receive a billet from an old woman, who, kneeling at her side, had conveyed it in such a mysterious manner as awakened the duenna's apprehensions about her young lady. She had therefore hastened home to communicate this piece of intelligence, that I might have an opportunity of examining the messenger before she could have time to deposit her trust. I could not help shivering with fearful presages upon this occasion, and even abhorring the person to whose duty and zeal I was beholden for the intelligence, even while I endeavoured to persuade myself that the inquiry would end in the detection of some paltry intrigue between the maid and her own gallant. I intercepted her in returning from church, and commanding her to follow me to a convenient place, extorted from her, by dint of threats, the fatal letter which I read to this effect: "The whole business of my life, O divine Serafina, will be to repay that affection I have been so happy as to engage. With what transport then I shall obey your summons, in performing that enterprise, which will rescue you from the bed of a detested rival, and put myself in full possession of a jewel which I value infinitely more than life! Yes, adorable creature, I have provided everything for our escape, and at midnight will attend you in your own apartment, from whence you shall be conveyed into a land of liberty and peace, where you will, unmolested, enjoy the purity of that religion you have espoused, and in full security bless the arms of your ever faithful Orlando. Were you a fond parent, a tender husband, a noble Castilian, I should not need to mention the unutterable horrors that took possession of my bosom, when I perused this accursed letter, by which I learned the apostasy, disobedience, and degeneracy of my idolised Serafina, who had overthrown and destroyed the whole plan of felicity which I had erected, and blasted all the glories of my name. And when the wretched messenger, terrified by my menaces and agitation, confessed that Antonia herself was privy to the guilt of her daughter, whom she had solemnly betrothed to that vile German, in the sight of Heaven, and that by her connivance this plebeian intended that very night to bereave me of my child, I was for some moments stupefied with grief and amazement, that gave way to an ecstasy of rage, which had well nigh terminated in despair and distraction. I now tremble, and my head grows giddy with the remembrance of that dreadful occasion. Behold how the drops trickle down my forehead. This agony is a fierce and familiar visitant. I shall banish it anon. I summoned my pride, my resentment, to my assistance. These are the cordials that support me against all other reflections. Those were the auxiliaries that enabled me, in the day of trial, to perform that sacrifice which my honour demanded, in a strain so loud as to drown the cries of nature, love, and compassion. Yes, they espoused that glory which humanity would have betrayed, and my revenge was noble, though unnatural. My scheme was soon laid, my resolution soon taken. I privately confined the wretch who had been the industrious slave of this infamous conspiracy, that she might take no step to frustrate or interrupt the execution of my design. Then, repairing to the house of an apothecary, who was devoted to my service, communicated my intention, which he durst not condemn, and could not reveal, without breaking the oath of secrecy I had imposed. And he furnished me with 2 vials of poison for the dismal catastrophe I had planned. Thus provided, I, on pretence of sudden business at Seville, carefully avoided the wretched pair, whom I had devoted to death, that my heart might not relent by means of those tender ideas which the sight of them would have infallibly inspired; and when daylight vanished, took my station near that part of the house through which the villain must have entered on his hellish purpose. There I stood, in a state of horrid expectation, my soul ravaged with the different passions that assailed it, until the fatal moment arrived, when I perceived the traitor approach the window of a lower apartment, which led into that of Serafina, and gently lifting the casement, which was purposely left unsecured, insinuated half of his body into the house. Then, rushing upon him in a transport of fury, I plunged my sword into his heart, crying, "Villain, receive the reward of thy treachery and presumption!" The steel was so well aimed as to render a repetition of the stroke unnecessary. He uttered one groan, and fell breathless at my feet. Exulting with this first success of my revenge, I penetrated into the chamber where the robber of my peace was expected by the unhappy Serafina and her mother, who, seeing me enter with a most savage aspect, and a sword reeking with the vengeance I had taken, seemed almost petrified with fear. "Behold," said I, "the blood of that base plebeian, who made an attempt upon the honour of my house. Your conspiracy against the unfortunate Don Diego de Zelos is now discovered. That presumptuous slave, the favoured Orlando, is now no more." Scarcely had I pronounced these words, when a loud scream was uttered by both the unhappy victims.
"If Orlando is slain," cried the infatuated Serafina, "what have I to do with life? Oh, my dear lord, my husband, and my lover! How are our promised joys at once cut off! Here, strike, my father, complete your barbarous sacrifice. The spirit of the murdered Orlando still hovers for his wife."
These frantic exclamations, in which she was joined by Antonia, kept up the fury of my resentment, which by meekness and submission might have been weakened and rendered ineffectual. "Yes, hapless wretches," I replied, "ye shall enjoy your wish. The honour of my name requires that both shall die. Yet I will not mangle the breast of Antonia, on which I have so often reposed. I will not shed the blood of Zelos, nor disfigure the beauteous form of Serafina, on which I have so often gazed with wonder and unspeakable delight. Here is an elixir, to which I trust the consummation of my revenge." So saying, I emptied the vials into separate cups, and, presenting one in each hand, the fair offenders instantly received the destined draughts, which they drank without hesitation. Then, praying to heaven for the wretched Don Diego, sunk upon the same couch, and expired without a groan. Oh, well contrived beverage! Oh, happy composition, by which all the miseries of life are so easily cured! Such was the fate of Antonia and Serafina. These hands were the instruments that deprived them of life. These eyes beheld them the richest prize that death had ever won. powers supreme! Does Don Diego live to make this recapitulation? I have done my duty, but I am haunted by the furies of remorse. I am tortured with the incessant stings of remembrance and regret. Even now, the images of my wife and daughter present themselves to my imagination. All the scenes of happiness I have enjoyed as a lover, a husband, and parent, all the endearing hopes I have cherished, now pass in a review before me, embittering the circumstances of my inexpressible woe, and I consider myself as a solitary outcast from all the comforts of society. But enough of these unmanly complaints. The yearnings of nature are too importunate. Having completed my vengeance, I retired into my closet, and furnishing myself with some ready money and jewels of considerable value, I went into the stable, saddled my favourite steed, which I instantly mounted, and, before the tumults of my breast subsided, found myself at the town of St. Lucar. There I learned from inquiry that there was a Dutch bark in the harbour ready to sail, upon which I addressed myself to the master, who, for a suitable gratification, was prevailed upon to weigh anchor that same night, so that, embarking without delay, I soon bid eternal adieu to my native country. It was not from reason and reflection that I took these measures for my personal safety, but in consequence of an involuntary instinct that seems to operate in the animal machine while the faculty of thinking is suspended. To what a dreadful reckoning was I called, when reason resumed her function! You may believe me, my friend, when I assure you that I should not have outlived those tragedies I acted, had I not been restrained from doing violence upon myself by certain considerations, which no man of honour ought to set aside. I could not bear the thought of falling ingloriously by the hand of an executioner, and entailing disgrace upon a family that knew no stain; and I was deterred from putting an end to my own misery by the apprehension of posthumous censure, which would have represented me as a desponding wretch, utterly destitute of that patience, fortitude, and resignation which are the characteristics of a true Castilian. I was also influenced by religious motives, that suggested to me the necessity of living to atone, by my sufferings and sorrow, for the guilt I had incurred in complying with a savage punctilio, which is, I fear, displeasing in the sight of Heaven. These were the reasons that opposed my entrance into that peaceful harbour which death presented to my view; and they were soon reinforced by another principle that sanctioned my determination to continue at the servile oar of life. In consequence of unfavourable winds, our vessel for some days made small progress in her voyage to Holland, and near the coast of Galicia we were joined by an English ship from Vigo, the master of which gave us to understand, that before he set sail, a courier had arrived from Madrid at that place, with orders of the corregidor to prevent the escape of any native Spaniard by sea from any port within his district, and to use his utmost endeavours to apprehend the person of Don Diego de Zelos, who was suspected of treasonable practices against the state. Such an order, with a minute description of my person, was at the same time dispatched to all the seaports and frontier places in Spain. You may easily suppose how I, who was already overwhelmed with distress, could bear this aggravation of misfortune and disgrace. I, who had always maintained the reputation of loyalty, which was acquired at the hazard of my life, and the expense of my blood. To deal candidly, I must own that this intelligence roused me from a lethargy of grief which had begun to overpower my faculties. I immediately imputed this dishonourable charge to the evil offices of some villain who had basely taken the advantage of my deplorable situation, and I was inflamed, inspirited with the desire of vindicating my fame and revenging the injury. Thus animated, I resolved to disguise myself effectually from the observation of those spies which every nation finds its account in employing in foreign countries. I purchased this habit from the Dutch navigator, in whose house I kept myself concealed, after our arrival in Amsterdam, until my beard was grown to a significant length to favour my design, and then appeared as a Persian dealer in jewels. As I could gain no satisfactory information touching myself in this country, had no purpose to pursue, and was extremely miserable among a people who, being mercenary and unsocial, were very ill adapted to alleviate the horrors of my condition, I gratified my landlord for his important services with the best part of my effects; and having, by his means, procured a certificate from the magistracy, repaired to Rotterdam, from whence I set out in a travelling carriage for Antwerp, on my way to this capital, hoping, with a succession of different objects, to mitigate the anguish of my mind, and by the most industrious inquiry, to learn such particulars of that false impeachment as would enable me to take measures for my own justification, as well as for projecting a plan of revenge against the vile perfidious author. This, I imagined, would be no difficult task, considering the friendship and intercourse subsisting between the Spanish and French nations, and the communicative disposition for which the Parisians are renowned. But I have found myself egregiously deceived in my expectation. The officers of police in this city are so inquisitive and vigilant, that the most minute action of a stranger is scrutinised with great severity; and although the inhabitants are very frank in discoursing on indifferent subjects, they are at the same time extremely cautious in avoiding all conversation that turns upon state occurrences and maxims of government. In a word, the peculiarity of my appearance subjects me so much to particular observation, that I have hitherto thought proper to devour my griefs in silence, and even to bear the want of almost every convenience, rather than hazard a premature discovery, by offering my jewels to sale. In this emergency I have been so far fortunate as to become acquainted with you, whom I look upon as a man of honour and humanity. Indeed, I was at first sight prepossessed in your favour, for, notwithstanding the mistakes which men daily commit in judging from appearances, there is something in the physiognomy of a stranger from which one cannot help forming an opinion of his character and disposition. For once my penetration hath not failed me. Your behaviour justifies my decision. You have treated me with that sympathy and respect which none but the generous will pay to the unfortunate. I have trusted you accordingly. I have put my life, my honour, in your power, and I must beg leave to depend upon your friendship, for obtaining that satisfaction for which alone I seek to live. Your employment engages you in the gay world. You daily mingle with the societies of men. The domestics of the Spanish ambassador will not shun your acquaintance. You may frequent the coffee houses to which they resort, and in the course of these occasions, unsuspected, inform yourself of that mysterious charge which lies heavy on the fame of the unfortunate Don Diego. I must likewise implore your assistance in converting my jewels into money, that I may breathe independent of man, until heaven shall permit me to finish this weary pilgrimage of life. End of chapter 26.